I just faced my own worst nightmare. The HOA president just filed eviction papers against me, claiming I had voluntarily signed away my own house. And her excuse? She said I gave her written permission. Funny thing is, the only thing signed that day was forging her own downfall. Let me start from the beginning. It all started with a tomato. A single glorious ruby red tomato. It was the first one of the season, a beefsteak variety that my wife, Clara, had been nursing since it was a spindly little seedling. I saw it hanging there, plump and perfect in the morning sun, and I felt a surge of simple, unadulterated pride. We had done it. We had carved out a little slice of paradise in our own backyard, here in the meticulously manicured, relentlessly beige community of Oak Haven. Our little vegetable patch wasn't just dirt and plants. It was our quiet rebellion, our testament to a life lived on our own terms, a life after the chaos of the city, after my long career in law, a life that was supposed to be peaceful. That peace lasted until exactly 9:15 a.m., when a shadow fell across our patio. I reminded her with a soft property line placard, but she strode right over it. I looked up from my coffee to see her, Karen Whitmore, president of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association, self-appointed queen of all she surveyed. She stood on the edge of our lawn, just beyond our property line, as if she were afraid to step on grass that might be a millimeter taller than regulation height. She was dressed in a crisp white pantsuit that looked like it had been starched with the tears of her enemies. Her hair was a blonde helmet, impervious to wind, reason, or mercy. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at my garden with an expression of such profound disgust, you'd think she'd just discovered a nest of scorpions in her breakfast cereal. "Bennett," she said, her voice a low, menacing hum that could curdle milk from 50 paces. She didn't use first names. First names were for friends, and Karen Whitmore didn't have friends. She had subjects. "What is this?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment too long. I'm a patient man, but my patience has its limits, and Karen had been testing those limits since the day we moved in. "Good morning to you too, Karen," I said, my voice deliberately cheerful. "It's a garden, you know, where food comes from. Those green things are zucchini, the leafy ones are lettuce, and this proud fellow right here," I gestured to the star of the show, "is a tomato." Her eyes, 2 chips of Arctic ice, finally swiveled to meet mine. "I know what a garden is, Bennett. What it is a violation." She tapped a thick binder she was clutching like a holy text. Section 9, subsection C, paragraph 4. All landscaping must be ornamental in nature and consistent with the pre-approved community aesthetic. Vegetables, she said, the word like it was a foul curse, are not ornamental. I couldn't help but let a small smile play on my lips. I'd read the HOA bylaws cover to cover before we even put in an offer on the house. I knew the rules better than she did. Actually, Karen, the bylaws are a bit vague on that point. They don't explicitly forbid vegetable gardens. Ornamental is a subjective term. I find a life-sustaining plant that produces delicious food to be quite beautiful, far more so than another boring, water-guzzling patch of useless grass. A muscle in her jaw twitched. I had corrected her. This was a cardinal sin in the Church of Karen. "It is not subjective," she hissed. "It is what I say it is. I am the president of this board. My interpretation is the only one that matters. That thing," she waved a dismissive hand at our beautiful garden, "is an eyesore. It lowers property values. It invites pests. The only pest it's invited so far is you, Karen," I muttered under my breath. Clara, who had been watching from the kitchen window, stifled a laugh. Clara's shoulders shook with nerves before it turned into a laugh of relief. Karen's hearing, however, was as sharp as her tongue. "What was that?" she demanded. I said, "I find that hard to believe," I answered smoothly. "It's neat, it's tidy, and it's tucked away behind the house. Nobody can even see it from the street. You had to come onto my property to even notice it." "My duties require me to perform regular inspections to ensure compliance," she shot back, puffing up her chest. "And you are not in compliance. You have 24 hours to remove it, every last plant, or the fines will begin." I stood up, placing my coffee mug down on the patio table with a deliberate clink. I'm not a tall man, but I made sure to stand to my full height. I'd faced down slick corporate lawyers and snarling prosecutors in my day. A suburban tyrant in a pantsuit wasn't going to intimidate me. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I don't think I will." For a second, she looked utterly stunned, as if a garden gnome had just stood up and recited Shakespeare. No one said no to Karen Whitmore. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. The garden stays. If you think you have the legal standing to fine me for it, then send the letter. We can let the process play out. But I'm not ripping out my wife's garden because you have a personal vendetta against vegetables." Her face transformed. The mask of icy authority cracked, revealing the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. Her lips curled back into a sneer. "You will regret this, Bennett. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I built this community. I protect it, and I will cut out any part that threatens it. You are a weed, and I always get rid of the weeds." She spun on her heel and marched away, her back as rigid as a fence post. I watched her go, a strange sense of unease settling in my stomach. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. I had challenged her authority directly, publicly. I had bruised her ego, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that she wouldn't just let this go. She had declared war. I just had no idea how dirty she was willing to fight. Clara came out onto the patio, wrapping her arms around me from behind. "Well," she whispered in my ear, "that went well." "Peachy," I replied, my eyes still fixed on the spot where Karen had stood. The first official shot had been fired. A formal violation notice would be in our mailbox by afternoon. I was sure of it. This was just the beginning, the opening move in a game I didn't want to play, but one I knew I couldn't afford to lose. My little slice of paradise was now a battlefield, and the enemy was already planning her next attack. When Clara and I decided to leave the city, we weren't just looking for a new house. We were looking for a new life. I had spent 40 years as a trial attorney, a life measured in billable hours, contentious depositions, and sleepless nights spent dissecting contracts and statutes. I was good at it, but it had taken its toll. The constant conflict, the adversarial nature of it all, had worn me down. Clara, my rock and my compass for every one of those years, had seen it more clearly than anyone. "Jim," she'd said one evening, looking at me over a stack of legal briefs that had become a permanent fixture on our dining table, "your fight is gone. You need to rest. We need to rest." She was right. We were tired. We dreamt of quiet mornings, of coffee on a patio, of time that belonged to us, not to a client or a court docket. Oak Haven was supposed to be that dream. On the surface, it was perfect. The brochures showed smiling families, pristine lawns, and a glistening community lake. The houses were solid, the streets were safe, and it was just far enough from the city to feel like a genuine escape. We saw the house with the big backyard, and Clara's eyes lit up. She saw a canvas. She'd always had a magical touch with plants, a gift for coaxing life from the soil. In our tiny city apartment, she'd filled every windowsill with pots of herbs and flowers, a miniature jungle in the concrete desert. Here, she saw possibilities. Specifically, she saw the perfect sun-drenched spot for the vegetable garden she'd always wanted. It was for her. All of this was for her. To see the stress melt from her face, to watch her spend her afternoons with her hands in the dirt, happy and content. That was the retirement I wanted. We should have known it was too good to be true. The first hint of trouble came from neighbor Fred. Fred lived 2 doors down, a retired postal worker with a passion for conspiracy theories and a heart of gold. He'd introduced himself the day we moved in by offering us a plate of slightly burnt cookies and a whispered warning. Amid cookies, Fred's smile momentarily flickered with dread, no longer just a neighborly host. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he'd said, leaning in conspiratorially. "It's nice. Mostly, just watch out for the Queen." "The Queen?" I'd asked, confused. "Karen Whitmore," he'd breathed, his eyes wide. "HOA president. Runs this place like her own personal kingdom. She's got eyes everywhere. They say she can tell if your trash can is put out 5 minutes too early from half a mile away. They say she has a direct line to the mayor. They say..." He'd gone on like that for 10 minutes, spinning tales of Karen's tyranny. She'd fined a family because their son's tricycle was the wrong shade of red. She'd tried to force another to resod their entire lawn because she didn't like the species of grass. I'd laughed it off at the time. It sounded like typical neighborhood gossip, embellished for dramatic effect. I was a retired lawyer. I wasn't going to be scared by an overzealous HOA president. I should have listened to Fred. My first direct encounter with Karen was a week after we moved in. She'd knocked on our door to deliver our official copy of the community bylaws, a document thicker than a phone book. "Read it, memorize it, live it," she'd instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. She wasn't welcoming us, she was indoctrinating us. Over the next few months, we watched her reign of terror from a safe distance. We'd see the official HOA violation notices stuck to our neighbors' doors, bright orange beacons of shame. We'd hear the hushed, angry conversations at the community mailbox. People were afraid of her. She wielded the bylaws like a weapon, twisting vague phrases to suit her whims and imposing her will on everyone. The board, which was supposed to be a panel of our peers, was nothing more than a rubber stamp, a collection of terrified sycophants who nodded along to her every decree. But we were keeping our heads down. We painted our mailbox the correct shade of taupe. We kept our lawn mowed to precisely 2.5 inches. We were model citizens of Karen's beige kingdom. Then spring came, and Clara started talking about her garden again. The spot in the back was perfect. It got 8 hours of direct sun. The soil was rich. "It'll be our little secret," she'd said, "tucked away where no one can see it. Just some tomatoes, some peppers, a little lettuce. It'll be our own little farmer's market." The joy on her face was all the convincing I needed. We spent a weekend building the raised beds, filling them with fresh soil, and carefully planting the seedlings. It became our shared project. I did the heavy lifting, and Clara, with her gentle touch, did the real magic. Watching those plants grow was more satisfying than any legal victory I'd ever won. It was real, it was tangible, it was ours. We were so caught up in our little bubble of horticultural bliss that we forgot the first rule of Oak Haven. The Queen is always watching. The morning she appeared on our patio, it felt like an invasion. She hadn't just insulted my garden, she had trespassed on our dream. She had taken this one pure, simple thing we had built for ourselves and declared it illegal. Standing there after she left, with Clara's arms around me, I knew this wasn't just a squabble over landscaping. This was a fundamental conflict of principles. Her need for absolute control versus our right to a little bit of happiness on our own property. And as a man who had spent his entire life fighting for principles, I found myself in a familiar, if unwelcome, position. I was being drawn back into the fray. I'd retired from the courtroom, but it seemed the courtroom was coming to me. The only question was, what would her opening salvo look like when the official notice arrived? The letter arrived the next day just as I predicted. It wasn't just tucked in our mailbox. It was taped to our front door, a stark white envelope positioned at eye level, so there was no chance of missing it. It felt less like a piece of mail and more like a public shaming, a modern-day stockade for the whole neighborhood to see. Inside, the official violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. Printed on thick, imposing letterhead, it cited the infamous Section 9, subsection C, and informed me that a fine of $50 had been levied against our account. It went on to state that the fine would double for every week the agricultural installation remained. I read it, then read it again. A part of me, the old lawyer part, almost admired its construction. It was designed to scare the average person into immediate submission. But I wasn't the average person. I sat down at my desk, pulled out my own copy of the HOA bylaws, and got to work. For the next hour, I dissected every word of Section 9. She was right, it did say landscaping had to be ornamental. But as I'd told her, that word was the key. It was subjective, legally ambiguous, and wide open to interpretation. More importantly, I found what wasn't there. There was no list of prohibited plants, no specific ban on vegetables, no definition of what constituted ornamental. Her entire case rested on her personal opinion. It was a classic case of a poorly written rule being enforced by a tyrant. Clara came and stood behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "What are you going to do, Jim?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm going to do what I do best," I said, turning to look at her. "I'm going to fight it, on principle. She's a bully, and the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up to them." My first step was to appeal, as was my right. I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board, not just to Karen. I laid out my case calmly and logically. I pointed out the ambiguity of the word ornamental. I argued that a well-maintained garden was an aesthetic asset, not a detriment. I even cited a few legal precedents from other states where courts had ruled in favor of homeowners in similar disputes. I requested a hearing at the next board meeting to present my case in person. I was professional, respectful, and legally sound. I was extending an olive branch, offering them a chance to be reasonable. I should have known they'd just use it as a switch to beat me with. The board meeting was held a week later in the community clubhouse. The room was sterile and joyless, just like the rest of Oak Haven. The board members, 4 nervous-looking individuals, sat at a long table at the front of the room. Karen sat in the middle, in a chair that was slightly larger than the others, like a throne. About 20 other residents were scattered around the room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. They wanted to see what would happen when someone finally pushed back. When my turn came to speak, I presented my case just as I had in my letter. I was calm, I was rational, I was non-confrontational. I passed out copies of my research. I thought, perhaps, that one of the other board members might see the logic in my argument. I was wrong. When I finished, Karen smiled, a thin, predatory slash of a smile. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "However, you seem to be under the mistaken impression that this is a democracy." A nervous titter went through her board members. "The board's purpose," she continued, her voice rising, "is to uphold the standards of this community. And those standards are set by me. Your interpretation of the rules is irrelevant. The board has already discussed this matter, and our decision is final. The violation stands. The fines will continue to accrue. Remove the garden." She looked down the table at her cronies. "All in favor of upholding the violation?" Every hand went up, some faster than others. "The motion carries. Next item on the agenda." Just like that, I was dismissed. I stood there for a moment, stunned by the sheer audacity of it. She hadn't even pretended to consider my points. The hearing was a sham, a piece of theater designed to reinforce her absolute power. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. I saw flickers of sympathy, but they were quickly extinguished by fear. No one spoke up. No one met my eye. They were too afraid. If Karen could do this to me over a few tomato plants, what could she do to them? As I walked out of that clubhouse, the cool night air felt like a slap in the face. The initial $50 fine had become $100. Next week it would be $200, then $400. This was no longer just about a garden or a poorly written rule. This was about a systemic abuse of power. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was crushing dissent. She was making an example of me to keep everyone else in line, and it was working. I felt a profound sense of isolation. Claire and I were on our own in this fight. The battle lines were clearly drawn, and Karen had just made a powerful move. I knew then that letters and logical arguments were not going to win this war. I had to find another way, a better weapon. Because if I didn't, those escalating fines would eventually become a lien on our house, and we could lose everything we'd worked for. The weeks that followed the board meeting were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The fines, as promised, doubled on schedule. First 200, then 4, then 8. The official notices kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. They started using words like delinquent and legal action. But Karen was too smart to stop there. She knew financial pressure was one thing, but social and emotional pressure was another. She wanted to break me. She wanted to make our lives so uncomfortable that we would just give up and rip out the garden. It started subtly. Our morning newspaper, which was always thrown neatly onto our driveway, started landing in the sprinkler-soaked flower bed. We spotted muddy footprints around the control box, but dared not trace them. The sprinklers themselves, which were on an automatic timer, would sometimes be mysteriously turned off on the hottest days, leaving Clara's petunias wilting. One afternoon, we came home to find that one single perfect tomato plant, the one that had produced the very first fruit of the season, had been snapped clean at the base. There was no sign of an animal, no storm. It was a deliberate, vicious little act of vandalism. A message. I started documenting everything. I took pictures of the broken plant. I kept a log of every strange occurrence. I saved every threatening letter. The lawyer in me knew that a pattern of harassment was a powerful tool, if I could ever get this in front of a real judge. But in the court of Oak Haven, Karen was the judge, jury, and executioner. Neighbor Fred became my unwilling informant. He'd scurry over to my yard, always looking over his shoulder as if snipers were posted on the rooftops. She was talking about you at the mailboxes, he'd whisper, his eyes wide. Told everyone you were a troublemaker, said you were intentionally trying to lower property values for the whole neighborhood. She's turning people against you, Jim. He was right. We started getting cold shoulders from neighbors who had previously been friendly. People would avert their eyes when we walked by. We were becoming pariahs. The pressure was getting to Clara. She tried to hide it, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She stopped spending as much time in the garden. It was no longer a place of joy for her. It was a source of constant stress. Maybe we should just give up, she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper. It's not worth it, Jim. It's just some vegetables. No, I said, my voice harder than I intended. I pulled her close. It was never about the vegetables, honey. It's about this. I gestured around our living room, at the life we had built. This is our home. We are not going to be bullied out of our own home. I will not let her win. Seeing the fear in Clara's eyes didn't make me want to quit. It poured gasoline on the fire of my resolve. This woman was hurting my wife. Now, it was personal. Karen's next move was to escalate things publicly. She called a special community town hall meeting. The flyer, posted on every lamppost, didn't mention me by name, but it didn't have to. It was about protecting our community standards and property values. It was a show trial, and I was the defendant. We had to go. Not showing up would have been an admission of guilt. The clubhouse was packed this time. Karen had rallied her troops. She stood at a podium, bathed in the unflattering fluorescent light, and delivered a fiery sermon. She spoke of outside influences and people who refuse to respect our shared values. She painted a picture of a perfect, harmonious community being threatened by one selfish individual who put his own trivial desires above the good of the whole. Weeks of hushed hallway whispers and side glances primed them for her rhetoric. She never said my name, but every head in the room turned to look at me and Clara. I could feel their glares. She was turning our neighbors into a mob. I stood up. I hadn't planned to, but I couldn't just sit there and take it. Karen, I said, my voice ringing out in the silent room. If you have something to say about me, say it to my face. Stop hiding behind vague accusations. She turned to me, a triumphant smirk on her face. This was what she wanted, a public confrontation she knew she could win. Very well, Mr. Bennett, since you wish to air your grievances publicly, you are in violation of our bylaws. You have been fined repeatedly. You have refused to comply. You are costing this community time and money. The question for the residents here tonight is simple. Do you want to live in a community where the rules apply to everyone, or one where certain individuals think they are above the law? A chorus of "everyone" and "make him follow the rules" erupted from the crowd. My heart sank. She had them. She had played them like a fiddle. We were completely and utterly alone. We left the meeting amidst a flurry of angry whispers and hostile stares. The weight of the entire community was now pressing down on us. The fines were approaching $1,000. We were isolated, harassed, and publicly condemned. Karen had backed us into a corner, and I was starting to run out of options. As we walked home in silence, I had no idea that her final, most devastating move was already in the mail, on its way to shatter our world completely. The envelope that arrived 3 days after the town hall meeting felt different. It wasn't a standard business envelope like the violation notices. This one was a large, stiff manila affair, sent via certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it at the door. The postman, a young guy I didn't recognize, looked at me with an expression of pity. My reputation had clearly preceded me. My stomach clenched as I took it. Certified mail is never good news. It's the delivery method of choice for lawsuits, subpoenas, and final demands. I took it inside and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. Clara came into the room, her eyes wide with apprehension. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, my voice grim. "But it's not a birthday card." With a deep breath, I sliced it open with a kitchen knife. My hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed me. I wasn't a man who rattled easily, but Karen's relentless campaign was starting to wear down my defenses. Inside was a thick sheaf of legal documents. The cover page was stark and terrifying. In bold, capital letters, it read, "Notice of eviction." I felt the blood drain from my face. Eviction? How was that possible? Fines, liens, sure. But eviction? That required a court order, a judge, a lengthy legal process. And HOA doesn't have the power to just kick someone out of a home they own. It was an outrageous overreach, a scare tactic of the highest order. I started flipping through the pages, my lawyer's brain kicking into overdrive, looking for the flawed logic, the legal loophole she was trying to exploit. The document was full of dense legal jargon, referencing obscure clauses in the HOA covenants that supposedly gave them this power. It was nonsense, of course, utterly unenforceable. I was almost ready to laugh at the sheer audacity of it, to dismiss it as her most desperate and foolish gambit yet. And then I saw it. It was the last page in the packet, an addendum titled Consent to Vacate. It was a simple one-page document. It stated that, in resolution of the ongoing dispute with the Oak Haven HOA, the homeowner, James Bennett, voluntarily agreed to vacate the property at 124 Willow Lane within 90 days. It was dated 2 weeks prior, and at the bottom, on the signature line, was my name, my signature. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never signed it. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, and I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. This wasn't a scare tactic. This wasn't an overreach. This was a crime. "Jim, what is it? You're as white as a sheet," Clara said, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the signature line. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the page. "But you didn't sign that," she whispered. "No, I didn't," I finally managed to say, my voice a hoarse croak. I picked up the page and held it closer. At first glance, it looked like my signature. The loops, the slant. It was all there. But the more I looked, the more I saw the fraud. The lines were just a little too shaky. The pressure of the pen was too uniform. My signature is quick, a fluid scrawl honed over decades of signing thousands of legal documents. This was slow, deliberate, careful. It wasn't written, it was drawn. It was the work of someone who had traced my signature. A cold, hard fury, unlike anything I had ever felt, began to build in the pit of my stomach. This changed everything. This was no longer a civil dispute about bylaws and vegetables. This had crossed a line into serious felony territory: forgery, mail fraud, attempted grand theft, because that's what stealing a house is. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a power-tripping bully anymore. She was a criminal, a desperate, dangerous criminal who was willing to forge legal documents to get her way. The full weight of it hit me. She had manufactured this evidence to make it look like I had simply given up, agreed to leave. She would present this to a judge to get an expedited eviction order, claiming she was just enforcing an agreement I had already made. She thought I would be too shocked, too intimidated to fight back. She thought I was just some tired old man. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had made the single biggest mistake of her life. She had given me the weapon I needed to not just defeat her, but to destroy her. I looked at Clara. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by the same cold anger I felt. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady now. I laid the forged document down on the table. A plan was already forming in my mind, a legal strategy taking shape with crystal clarity. I wasn't a retired attorney anymore. As of this moment, I was back in the game. "What are we going to do?" I repeated, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. "We're going to give her enough rope to hang herself, and I'm going to personally kick the chair out from under her." This war was about to enter a whole new phase. For a full day, I did nothing. I let the forged eviction notice sit on my desk, a monument to Karen's depravity. My initial white-hot rage cooled and hardened into something else, a cold, methodical resolve. I had a choice to make, a critical strategic decision that would define the rest of this conflict. The easy path was to simply expose the forgery. I could hire a handwriting expert, get an affidavit, and present it to the HOA's legal counsel. The eviction would be dead on arrival. Karen would be embarrassed, perhaps even forced to resign as president. The garden would be safe. It would be a win. But would it be justice? That question echoed in my mind. If I just cut off this one head of the Hydra, the beast itself would remain. Karen might be gone, but the culture of fear she'd created, the compliant board, The weaponized bylaws, all of that would still be there. Someone else, maybe someone she had trained, would take her place. My neighbors would still be afraid. The systemic rot in Oak Haven would remain. Exposing the forgery would save my house, but it wouldn't save my community. And as I thought about it, I realized that somewhere along the line, this had become about more than just my house. It was about the principle of the thing. You don't let a criminal get away with a crime just because you managed to dodge the bullet. So I was at a crossroads. Do I take the simple, direct route to save myself? Or do I embark on a more dangerous, more complicated path to get real justice? To not just stop Karen, but to dismantle the entire corrupt system she had built? The core question stared me right in the face. How far was I willing to go to defend my own? And what exactly did my own now mean? Was it just Clara and me? Or did it include the silent, terrified neighbors cowering behind their perfectly manicured lawns? I found my answer while talking to neighbor Fred. He came over that evening, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He'd heard rumors of the certified letter. "Is it true, Jim?" he whispered, clutching a bag of what smelled like burnt popcorn. "Did she really try to evict you?" I nodded grimly. "She's claiming I signed a document agreeing to leave." Fred's face went pale. "But you didn't, right?" When I shook my head, his eyes went wide with a strange mix of terror and excitement. "She forged it. I knew it. The woman is capable of anything. Anything. This goes deeper than grass height, Jim. I've been telling you, it has to be about the money." I usually dismissed Fred's conspiratorial ramblings, but this time, his words hit a nerve. "The money? What about the money?" "The HOA fees," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "They go up every single year, way faster than inflation, 10% last year. But what are we getting for it? The pool liner is still torn, the clubhouse roof leaks, and the front gate has been broken for 6 months. Where is all that money going, Jim? You're a lawyer. You should look into it. Follow the money. It's always the money." He was right. It was so obvious I was mad at myself for not thinking of it sooner. I had been so focused on the legality of the garden dispute that I hadn't looked at the bigger picture. Why was Karen so desperate to get rid of me? Not just me, but anyone who challenged her authority. It wasn't just about ego. A bully that desperate, that willing to commit a felony, has something to hide. A simple power trip doesn't explain forgery, but protecting a criminal enterprise? That does. Her iron-fisted rule wasn't just about control. It was a defense mechanism. She kept everyone so terrified of minor infractions that they would never dare to ask the big questions. Like, "Can we see the books?" That night, I laid it all out for Clara. The two paths. The easy win versus the righteous but risky war. "If I do this," I told her, "if I start digging into the finances, she will fight back even harder. It could get ugly." Clara didn't hesitate for a second. She put her hand over mine on the kitchen table. "Jim, that woman tried to steal our home. She terrorizes our neighbors. She hurt you, and she made me afraid to walk in my own garden. This was never just about us. Fred is right. This is bigger. Do whatever it takes. I'm with you all the way." That was all I needed to hear. My moral crossroads had become a straight path. My objective was no longer just to survive. It was to liberate Oak Haven. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was launching a counteroffensive. I would use her crime as the key, but I wouldn't stop there. I would unlock every door she had sealed shut and expose every secret she had buried. I was going to pull on that one loose thread, the forged signature, and I wouldn't stop pulling until her entire corrupt kingdom had unraveled at her feet. The decision was made. The war was on. My first calls the next morning would be to a private investigator and the best forensic handwriting expert I knew. The moment I decided to go on the offensive, a switch flipped in my brain. The retired, peace-seeking homeowner was gone, and the methodical 40-year veteran of legal combat was back in the command chair. My first call was to Marcus Thorne, a private investigator I'd used on a few messy corporate cases years ago. Mark was a former detective, a guy who could find a needle in a haystack and then find out who forged the needle's serial number. "Jimmy boy," his gruff voice boomed over the phone. "Thought you'd be spending your days playing golf and yelling at squirrels. Don't tell me you're back in the game." "Something like that, Mark," I said. "I've got a situation. An HOA president who's part dragon, part mob boss. She forged my signature on a document to try and steal my house. There was a low whistle on the other end of the line. That's a bold move. What do you need? Everything, I said. I want her life under a microscope. Financials, personal connections, business dealings. And I need you to look at the HOA's books. I have a feeling our queen is hiding a treasure chest somewhere, and I want to know what's in it. My second call was to Dr. Elena Petrova, a forensic document examiner whose testimony in court was legendary. She was a quiet, intense woman who treated handwriting analysis with the reverence of an art historian and the precision of a physicist. I emailed her a high-resolution scan of the forged document and a dozen samples of my real signature. With my professional team in motion, I started my own investigation. Under the HOA bylaws, any member had the right to inspect the association's financial records with reasonable notice. It was a right no one had ever dared to exercise. I sent a formal registered letter to the HOA board, CCing Karen, of course, requesting access to the last 5 years of financial statements, bank records, and vendor contracts. I knew it would set off alarm bells in her office, but that was the point. I wanted her to know I was coming for her. The response was predictable. An email from Karen arrived less than an hour later. It was curt and dismissive. The association's records are reviewed annually by a certified auditor and are in full compliance. Your request is a baseless and harassing fishing expedition. Access denied. Bingo. An illegal denial. That was obstruction, and it was another piece of ammunition for my growing arsenal. She was panicking. She was trying to stonewall me, but she had just handed me a legal crowbar. 2 days later, Mark called with his initial findings. "Okay, Jimmy, this lady's interesting," he said. "On paper, she's clean, lives modestly, drives a 3-year-old sedan. But the HOA's finances, they're a mess. The books are sloppy, but one thing keeps jumping out at me. A vendor called Oak Haven Landscaping and Maintenance. They get paid a fortune." "We have a landscaping company that comes every Tuesday," I said. "They're called Green Thumb Lawns." "Exactly," Mark said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "Green Thumb gets paid about $50,000 a year. But this other company, Oak Haven Landscaping, has been paid over $500,000 over the last 4 years. We're talking huge regular payments for things like seasonal planting, irrigation system upgrades, tree removal. Thing is, I talked to a few of your neighbors. No one has ever seen them. This company doesn't seem to exist." My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The smoking gun Fred had predicted. "It's a shell company," I breathed. "She's billing the HOA for work that was never done and pocketing the money." "Looks that way," Mark confirmed. "It's classic embezzlement. The iron-fisted rule, the crazy enforcement. It's all a smokescreen. She keeps everyone terrified of a $50 fine for a mismatched mailbox, so no one ever thinks to ask where $500,000 went." The very next day, Doctor, Petrova's report landed in my inbox. It was beautiful. Page after page of detailed analysis, with side-by-side comparisons, magnification blow-ups, and pressure point mapping. Her conclusion was unequivocal and written in language a judge would love. The signature on the consent to vacate document, she wrote, is a non-genuine signature. It exhibits clear and numerous indicators of a slow, traced simulation. The probability that it was written by the same hand that produced the known signatures of James Bennett is, for all practical purposes, 0. I now had 2 separate powerful bombshells. The forgery was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, and the financial motive was clear. A massive, long-term embezzlement scheme. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a forger. She was a thief on a grand scale. She hadn't just tried to steal my house. She had been stealing from all of us for years. The garden wasn't the issue. My refusal to back down was the issue. I was a loose cannon on the deck of her sinking ship, a threat that had to be eliminated at any cost. I sat back in my chair, the evidence spread across my desk. I had her. I had her on forgery, I had her on fraud, and I had her on embezzlement. The case was solid, a legal Iron Maiden ready to snap shut. All I had to do was put it all together and choose the right venue to spring the trap. But just as I was basking in the glow of my impending victory, Mark called again. His voice was different this time, tense. "Jim, I dug deeper into that shell company," he said. "Oak Haven Landscaping. I found out who owns it. You're not going to believe this. Who is it, Mark? I asked, a knot of tension forming in my gut. I expected him to say it was Karen herself, using a fake name or some distant unknown relative. The reality was both more shocking and, in a strange way, more pathetic. The owner of record, Mark said, his voice heavy, is a man named Martin Whitmore, Karen's older brother. The name didn't mean anything to me at first, but Mark wasn't finished. And Martin Whitmore isn't just her brother, Jim. He has a record, a long one. 2 separate convictions for fraud, another for extortion. He did 5 years in state prison. He got out about 6 years ago, right around the time Oak Haven Landscaping was incorporated, and the big payments from your HOA started. I sank back into my chair, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clang. This wasn't what I expected. A convicted fraudster, an extortionist. This wasn't a simple case of a power-hungry woman lining her own pockets. This was organized, it was professional, and it was far more dangerous than I had imagined. So, she's not working alone, I said, thinking out loud. She's in on it with her criminal brother. That's what I thought at first, Mark replied. A cozy family business, but something felt off. Why would she be so reckless, forging a signature on a document for a lawyer? It's sloppy, it's desperate. It's not the move of a confident criminal. So I kept digging, I pulled her personal bank records, and I found the real story. He paused for dramatic effect. I gripped the phone tighter. And, Mark said, she's not rich, Jim. She's broke. Her accounts are a mess. She's barely making her mortgage payments. Almost all the money from the shell company is going directly to her brother, Martin. And I found something else. Regular, small payments from her personal checking account to his. The exact same amount every single month for the last 6 years. It looks less like she's his partner and more like she's his victim. The twist was so unexpected it left me breathless. It was a complete reframing of the entire situation. Blackmail, I whispered. That's my bet, Mark said. My theory? Karen started out as exactly what you thought she was. A petty tyrant who loved the power of being HOA president. She probably bent a few rules, enjoyed the control. But then her big brother gets out of prison. He's a career criminal. He sees his sister in a position of power, with access to a steady stream of cash. Maybe she did something shady in the past, something he knows about. Maybe he just threatened her. Either way, he forces her to set up this scheme. She becomes the public face, the iron-fisted ruler who keeps everyone too scared to look at the books, while he sits in the background and bleeds the community dry. I thought about it, replaying all my interactions with her. The desperate, almost rabid intensity. The willingness to commit a felony over a vegetable garden. It wasn't just about protecting her power, it was about protecting her secret. If I, a lawyer who wouldn't back down, got a look at the financials, I wouldn't just expose her, I would expose him. And a man with a record for extortion would not take that lightly. Her over-the-top tyranny wasn't just a personality flaw. It was a cage. She was a monster, yes, but she was a monster on a leash. And her brother was holding that leash. This changed the moral calculus of the situation, but it didn't change my objective. Karen Whitmore was still a criminal. She was still complicit. Being coerced doesn't absolve you of grand larceny and forgery, but it made her a more complex, more tragic figure. She wasn't a kingpin. She was a pawn, a deplorable, menacing pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. My real target, the true villain of this story, was a man I'd never even met, Martin Whitmore. This new information made my plan even more critical. It was no longer enough to just expose her in a community meeting or to the HOA board. This had to be handled by the full weight of the law. This had moved far beyond the jurisdiction of an HOA dispute. This was a matter for the police, for the district attorney, for a criminal court. I realized the eviction notice, the forgery, was an act of pure desperation. She must have told her brother about the stubborn lawyer who wouldn't back down, the one who was now asking to see the financial records. He must have ordered her to get rid of me, by any means necessary. And in her panic, she made a clumsy, fatal mistake. She signed her own death warrant and his, with that forged signature. My path was now clearer than ever. I couldn't just present this to the HOA's lawyers. They might try to sweep it under the rug to avoid a scandal. I had to bypass the entire corrupt structure of Oak Haven. I had to take this to a higher power, My 40 years in the legal system had taught me that there are times to negotiate and times to file. This was a time to file. I spent the next 2 days drafting the most important document of my career. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a petition for judicial review, a direct appeal to a real court. I laid out the entire saga, starting with the garden and ending with the embezzlement scheme. I attached Mark's investigation summary, Dr. Petrova's forensic report, and copies of every threatening letter. And, most importantly, I included my evidence of the forgery and Karen's illegal refusal to provide financial records. I wasn't just asking a judge to overturn a petty fine. I was asking a judge to intervene, to investigate, and to bring the full force of the law down on a criminal conspiracy. When I filed the petition at the county courthouse, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The trap was set. All the pieces were in place. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing in front of a judge in 2 weeks. Karen Whitmore would be served with a summons. She and her brother would have no idea what was about to hit them. They thought they were fighting a retired old man over some tomato plants. They were about to find out they had picked a fight with the entire justice system. The day of the hearing was gray and overcast, a perfect backdrop for the drama I knew was about to unfold. I sat next to my lawyer. I'd hired a sharp young attorney named Sarah to officially represent me, knowing it was always better to have another voice in the room, and watched as Karen Whitmore strode into the courtroom. She wasn't wearing her usual power pants suit. Instead, she'd opted for a severe, dark blue dress, an attempt at projecting somber authority. She was flanked by her own lawyer, a smug-looking man with slicked-back hair who oozed undeserved confidence. He clearly thought this was a joke, a minor dispute that would be swatted down in minutes. Karen shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred as she took her seat. She thought she was here to finally crush me. She had no idea she was walking into her own execution. The judge was a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Moore. She had a reputation for being sharp, impatient with fools, and fiercely protective of the law. When she entered, the courtroom fell silent. She looked down at the petition I had filed, her eyes scanning the first few pages. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "This is quite the narrative. An eviction over a vegetable garden?" Karen's lawyer, a man named Erickson, stood up. "Your Honor, this is a frivolous and vexatious action. Mr. Bennett has been a disruptive presence in our community. This is simply a retaliatory measure for the HOA enforcing its long-standing bylaws. In fact, Mr. Bennett had already agreed to resolve the matter by vacating the premises, and then apparently changed his mind." He gestured grandly to the forged document, which was already entered as their primary piece of evidence. "Exhibit A, Your Honor, a signed consent form." Judge Moore looked at the document, then back at me. "Mr. Bennett, your petition claims this signature is a forgery." "That is correct, Your Honor," I said, standing up. "It is a clumsy and fraudulent tracing." Erickson scoffed loudly. "Objection! That is a baseless and slanderous accusation." "It is not slander if it is true, counsel," Judge Moore snapped, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "And I will be the judge of that. Do you have proof, Mr. Bennett?" This was the moment. "I do, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I would like to call my expert witness, Dr. Elena Petrova, and to use the courtroom's audio-visual equipment for a brief demonstration." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Erickson's face for the first time. He clearly hadn't anticipated this. Judge Moore nodded. "Permission granted. Let's see what you've got." Dr. Petrova was sworn in. She was calm, professional, and radiated an aura of unimpeachable expertise. She walked to the large screen at the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, "I was asked to examine the question signature on Exhibit A and compare it with multiple known signatures provided by Mr. Bennett." On the screen, a high-resolution image of the forged signature appeared. "This is the signature in question, Doctor," Petrova said. "Now, if you'll watch closely." She clicked a button, and a second image, one of my genuine signatures, flew across the screen and laid itself directly on top of the forgery. They were a perfect match. Too perfect. A gasp went through the small gallery. Karen's lawyer stared, his mouth slightly agape. "As you can see," Dr. Petrova continued, her voice steady, "the two signatures are a near-perfect superimposition. In forensic science, this is one of the clearest signs of a tracing. No person ever signs their name exactly the same way twice. There are always natural variations in spacing, size, and slant. The only way to achieve this level of congruence is to trace an authentic signature. She then began to zoom in, showing the shaky lines, the unnatural pen lifts, the uniform pressure. It was a devastating, irrefutable visual presentation. The forgery wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was a visible, undeniable fact. Furthermore, I said, standing up again as doctor, Petrova concluded, "We have the motive, Your Honor. This wasn't just about a garden. It was about preventing me from discovering a multi-year, $500,000 embezzlement scheme." Erickson shot to his feet. "Objection! This is outrageous. There is no evidence of any such thing." "On the contrary," my lawyer, Sarah, said smoothly, stepping forward and placing a thick binder on the judge's bench. "We have bank records, vendor invoices for a shell company named Oak Haven Landscaping, and a full report from a private investigator, a company owned by Karen Whitmore's brother, Martin Whitmore, a convicted felon." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge's face was a mask of cold fury. She looked from the binder to Karen. Karen's face had gone from confident to shocked to ashen white. The mask was gone. All that was left was raw, naked panic. She looked at her lawyer, but he was staring at the binder on the judge's bench as if it were a bomb. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Moore said, her voice dangerously quiet, "stand up." Karen rose unsteadily, her hands trembling. "Did you forge this document?" the judge demanded. Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked around desperately, her eyes wild. "It wasn't my idea," she finally stammered, her voice cracking. "He made me do it. My brother, he made me do everything." It was a confession, a full confession, right there in open court. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. Judge Moore stared at Karen for a long, silent moment. The air in the room was thick with tension. When the judge finally spoke, her words were like chips of ice. "Ms. Whitmore, what you have just admitted to in my courtroom, in addition to the mountain of evidence presented here, constitutes probable cause for multiple felony charges: forgery, fraud, perjury, obstruction of justice." She looked over at the bailiff. "Officer, take Ms. Whitmore into custody." The bailiff moved towards a stunned Karen, who began to sob uncontrollably. "And that's not all," the judge added, her voice ringing with authority. "Issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of Martin Whitmore in connection with this fraud and potential extortion. This HOA is clearly compromised. I am placing the Oak Haven Homeowners Association into temporary receivership, effective immediately. All board authority is suspended." The showdown was over. It wasn't just a victory. It was a total annihilation. Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with pathetic, whimpering sobs. I had won. But watching her be taken away, a broken woman who had been both a villain and a victim, I didn't feel the elation I expected. I just felt a profound sense of relief, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Justice, it turned out, had finally come to Oak Haven. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Karen and her brother Martin were arrested that same day. Faced with the mountain of evidence, they both took plea deals to avoid a lengthy trial. Karen got 5 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution for her part in the fraud. Martin, as a repeat offender, was sent back to prison for a much longer stretch. The news spread through Oak Haven like a wildfire, first in hushed whispers, then in triumphant shouts. The queen was deposed. The tyrant was gone. The dark cloud that had hung over our community for years had finally lifted. The court-appointed receiver, a competent and fair-minded administrator, dissolved the old board and called for new elections. The reign of terror was replaced by a wave of transparency. For the first time, the HOA's finances were made public for all to see. The fear that Karen had cultivated for so long evaporated overnight. People started talking to each other again, not in whispers, but in open, friendly conversation. The oppressive beige conformity began to crack. The most beautiful change, however, was a quiet one. A week after the hearing, I saw my next-door neighbor, a man who had previously been terrified of Karen, out in his backyard with a shovel. He was building a small, raised bed. A few days later, the family across the street planted a row of pepper plants along their fence line. Then another family planted herbs in a window box. Our little act of rebellion had started a revolution. The gardens weren't just gardens, they were symbols of freedom, little patches of green defiance sprouting up all over the neighborhood. Clara and I reclaimed our own garden. It was no longer a battlefield, but once again, a place of peace. We stood there one evening, watching the sun set, the air filled with the scent of tomato leaves and damp earth. My fight was over. I had been pushed, and I had pushed back with everything I had. The core question of how far a man will go to defend his own had been answered. You go as far as you have to. You fight until the fight is won, not for revenge, but for restoration. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. Neighbor Fred came over, carrying a freshly baked and only slightly burnt apple pie. "You did it, Jim," he said, beaming. "You actually did it. You took down the queen and liberated the kingdom." I smiled. In the end, it wasn't about a kingdom or a queen. It was about a home. It was about the simple, profound right to plant a tomato in your own backyard and watch it grow in peace. And as I looked at Clara, her face happy and relaxed for the first time in months, I knew that was a right worth fighting for. Justice, like a well-tended garden, can flourish anywhere, but sometimes you have to be willing to pull the weeds first.